After choosing empowerment over dread, I began searching for meaningful and effective solutions to put into practice in my own life. Progressive Hedonist is a podcast to share the ways we can take on climate change through food and joy. On days when this seems completely impossible, this podcast is a reminder that each of us can make an impact. I'm Dana Cowan. Join me in conversations with thought leaders like Alice Waters, Andrew Zimmern, Dr. Ayanna Elizabeth Johnson, and more. We can learn together what is possible. You can listen anywhere podcasts can be found and join the conversation on Instagram at progressive_hedonist.
I got a call from NASA, and they were having trouble creating food that the astronauts could really taste because they lost their ability to taste spicy foods when they were on the International Space Station over long periods of time. So they wanted advice from Emeril about how to make the food tastier. And that's really all the call was about. But then I said, can he make them some of his food, and can't we send it up there? And the PR person on the NASA side paused, and then she said, I don't know, let me find out. And she had, you can imagine the red tape on her side to go through this. And it took us 18 months. But eventually, we freeze-dried his food, and we sent it up to the guys on the space station, and we did a kind of ship-to-shore little communication with them for the show. And they loved his food, and it was spicy enough.
Welcome to Kochlöffel, a podcast series about the remarkable contribution of Jewish women to the world of food. In almost every aspect of our food system, way out of proportion to our numbers in the world, Jewish women rise professionally and personally in virtually every aspect of food. These women are wonderful. Chefs, academics, editors and writers, corporate strategists, restaurant owners, policy wonks, media figures, and more. And that's what a Kochlöffel is. In German, a Kochlöffel is simply a soup ladle, but in Yiddish, that wonderful, ironic, juicy language, a Kochlöffel is someone who stirs things up, makes things happen, and that's what these women in our midst do. They make good things happen. When we first began to work on Kochlöffel, doing a podcast series on Jewish women in food was not controversial. Clearly, in today's moment, everything having to do with Jews or Israel is complex. But as fraught as this time is, we need to come together and celebrate the good that we do, the joyful things we do as individuals and as a world community. In a way, we believe that it is more important than ever to shine a light on remarkable Jewish women in food. Our guest, Karen Katz, is a veteran executive TV producer and writer with over 1,500 hours of television programming to her credit. Her illustrious career includes producing for networks such as the Food Network, Discovery Networks, HBO Family, and more. She has worked on competition, lifestyle, documentary, reality, children's TV, and music and variety programmings both domestically and internationally. Karen was the executive producer of Emeril Live during its pinnacle and experienced firsthand the whirlwind of excitement, chaos, and creativity that unfolded behind the scenes. In her new memoir, Getting Sauced, How I Learned Everything I Know About Food from Working in TV, is your backstage pass into the enthralling world of early food television, seasoned with humor, heart, and a dash of culinary magic. I love this book. Karen's upbringing in Long Island, where Lipton soup mix and orange juice reigned supreme in the kitchen, laid the foundation for her flavorful adventures. From humble beginnings to haute cuisine, her narrative charts a course from Mrs. Paul's fish sticks to Michelin-starred delicacies, offering you a taste of glutton to glamour transformation that has defined her culinary evolution. Let's have a listen to Karen Katz. Karen, I have just finished reading in, honestly, 2 sittings, your new book, Getting Sauced. And I love the subtitle, Getting Sauce, How I Learned Everything I Know About Food from Working in TV. So for those of us who haven't had the advantage of reading the book in two settings as I have, tell us about the book.
It's actually the story of a nice girl from Long Island who grew up with a mother who had absolutely no interest in food and lived off of Jolly Green Giant and Mrs. Paul's, and how I made the leap and had a very interesting journey to become executive producer of one of the country's most beloved shows, cooking shows, Emeril Live. I would often go to parties, and when people heard what I did, they always wanted to know about all of the backstage stuff and how do you do what you do? How does food happen on TV? So I had the idea for the book for a long time, and the only good thing about COVID is that it gave me time to actually sit down and write it. It's really a fun romp and a behind the scenes for anybody who likes food or is interested in food. And I had a really good life thanks to food. It was really fun to write it, and I just hope people enjoy reading it.
You got involved at the sort of the toehold, the very beginning of the Food Network with Emeril. Did you come out of a TV? Did you come out of food? How did that happen?
I had never done any food television, and I was a producer. I did children's television, and I did documentaries, everything pretty much except fictional work. And I was a freelancer, so you go where the work is. And I got a call from the Food Network, and I thought, who wants to do a food show? Back then, it was not cool. It was Julia Child and Graham Carey probably were the only shows that had any success, and they were already for an older generation. And the Food Network was barely in any households, and their production value was really low. It was like the parodies from Saturday Night Live. So I thought, oh, God, this could be the kiss of death to my career. But I was in between jobs, and I said, what the hell? I'll do it for 6 months. We'll see what happens. And who knew? I was there at the forefront of when it just exploded. And those 6 months turned into 10 years with Emeril Live, and then beyond that, doing other food shows.
One of the things that was just so fun about watching Emeril Live was that it was a live studio audience, like a game show. Where did that concept come from?
I wish I could take credit for it. I can't. There are many people who do take credit for it who should not. But I believe originally the concept came from a guy named Joe Langham, who I'd never met, actually. The show was on the air. The president of the network at the time, Erica Gruen, really liked the idea. They did a pilot, and it went really well. So then they decided to make it into a series. And the first year was a little rocky, and they had a lot of behind-the-scenes issues. And that's when I got called in. It was complicated. And they just really they had so many culinary people working on the show and people from magazines, but they didn't have TV people. So that's why I was brought in.
And explain to me why having that many culinary people didn't solve the problem and why they needed a TV person. Of course they had a TV person. They were going to do a TV show, but they hadn't thought that through. They didn't understand the demands of TV, or
they didn't understand a production the size of Emeril Live. Everything they had done to date was very simple, small studio, not a lot of movement, 4 cameras, stationary, and it was fairly simple. People with basic production skills could do that. But when you start to add audiences and multi-camera and you're doing something live to tape, you need an organization really to make it happen. Otherwise, nothing will get done or bad things will happen. They just didn't have anyone who had worked on that scale, I think, something working on a production that big. I had done that, and there are skills that you need to have or ways that you need to know how to produce something like that.
And how hard was it for Emeril to become that person who's essentially bamming and throwing things? He was actually a real chef and a real cook. Was it easy to get him to morph into this sort of TV stardom?
I think what really did it, quite frankly, was the audience. Like all good performers, if you think about it, they really feed off of the audience, and the audience gave him the energy. And I think when you're in front of a group of people, it's like your adrenaline naturally spikes. You're really in a heightened experience. And I think that allowed him to open up and really just have fun with it. It happened gradually, but he was bamming when I met him. But he really got very comfortable. I always said that my job was to create an environment for him to feel as comfortable as he can be doing what he has to do. He shouldn't have to worry about anything going on backstage or is the food going to show up in time. It's just he needs to know that everything is running smoothly. And that was one of the problems. He was so used to the restaurant world where everything went the way that he wanted it. And he couldn't take the chaos that was going on or the disorganization. It didn't take us long to gel because we both had the same mindset.
And who set the menus? Who decided what was going to be in each show?
It was a collaborative thing between his culinary team and Emeril and our culinary team. Sometimes the network would have requests. We always had to do holiday shows, and there were a handful of shows that we knew we had to do. After doing so many shows, you want to make sure you have a nice balance. You don't want to do chicken all the time. We tried to come up with interesting themes. So that was a collaborative experience. And then the process was Emeril and his team would give us the recipes. They would create them. His culinary team would develop them. But then they would give us the recipe, and then it would be just like a recipe that would go in a cookbook or you'd see in a magazine. And then my team would take it and what we call do a recipe breakdown, which is done for television. And what that means is they would go through the whole thing and break it down for the shoppers. You know, we need to know what to shop, and break it down per act. And also anything that needed to get prepared ahead of time. You know, if something needed to marinate overnight or, you know, all of these things so that everything was done in different stages. And then that team would, when it came time to actually tape the show, there were literally 6 acts in the hour and there were 6 carts that would come out with everything that was needed for that particular act. And the other thing that was really tricky is that he would have multiple recipes going on throughout the show. He didn't just do one dish and finish it in an act. So our team had to figure all that out, how to weave it all together so that at the end of the show, he could plate his final dish with the sides or whatever it might be. It was quite a difficult process.
He strikes me as a obviously larger-than-life personality. Was it hard to corral him in so that he could figure out what he needed to do to make each show a success or each show tidy?
Not really. Off camera, he's actually a quiet guy and a very thoughtful guy and a serious businessman. He didn't like to waste time. We would talk through everything until he was satisfied with it. But once he was on air, occasionally he would have a little too much fun on air and he would maybe make innuendos that you hoped he wouldn't make. But I always had the power of post-editing if I needed. But he had a good sense of how far to take it to the line and how far not to.
I read about some of the things that you did, especially the off-premise things that you did. And I've done a fair amount of production, not TV production, but event production. And I thought, oh my effing God, how did they pull that off? How did you pull it off? There were a couple of them that were just extraordinary. Casts of thousands.
Yeah, that is what is so satisfying about what we do. Sometimes when you're in the midst of it and they're long days, you wonder, why am I doing this? This is the hours are nuts and all that. But you would come up with an idea or somebody would suggest something and it might sound impossible, but the challenge is in pulling it off. And, you know, you need a great team. Nothing's done by yourself. And I did have a great team. One of the first big things we did was in Chicago's Grant Park. It was for Taste of Chicago. And we had no idea if people would show up. And we had one day to do it, get the set in, and there was no rehearsal, no nothing, and it was outside. With 95 degrees and the weather threatening to rain at any given moment. And you just pray that it's all going to work out. And it never seems like it will. Things go wrong throughout the day, and then you get to taping time, and it's a miracle. But everything is in place, and everything is ready to go. And you just push forward. And you just have to have people with you that can put out the fires and deal with their departments or whatever it might be. We had a great team, and we had a blast. It was so satisfying that you pull it off after all of that.
I loved reading the vignette about Grant Park in the book and just how you got exactly to that moment where you were a wrap and the weather moved in.
Yeah.
Just an incredible story.
The best part was the part about my mother, who controlled the weather. She became a mascot for the show, and she just had this thing about if there was an event that anyone had and you needed it to be a nice day, like a wedding or whatever, you would tell my mother in advance. She needed a warning, and she would just manage. She would watch the Weather Channel, and she held off the front. And that particular day, it was supposed to rain the whole day. And it was miserable, but it never did rain until, as you said, we went to black at the end of the show, and then the floodgates opened. But she did it. She pulled it off.
I thought all the stories about your mother were totally fabulous in it. And also, I am someone with a mother who, if she could have fed us all bran and orange juice and granola bars at every meal for her, that would have been fine. So my reaction formation was, of course, to get involved in food. And here you are, a food person. How did you start? I would have been intimidated by working with somebody like a culinary team for Emeril. How did you start getting your cooking chops?
In the beginning, I really was intimidated in the sense that they all knew that I didn't come from food. And in the kitchen, back in the kitchen, they were a great group. Susan Stockton was the head of the Food Network kitchen, and she was a lovely woman. And they really wanted me to succeed because if I knew what I was doing, it would be easier for them. So there was no reason for them not to support me. So they were fantastic, in the beginning and all through the whole process. And, I remember one of the cooks one day, I just went back and she taught me the proper way to dice an onion. I mean, they were just very generous people. And if you wanted to know something, they would teach you how to do it. And so over time, I really got into it. Emeril made it very exciting, fascinating. The only thing was that Emeril never listened to me about any food suggestions. He listened to me about everything about TV, any remotes we wanted to do, anything. But if I ever had a food suggestion, it was like Charlie Brown, the teacher, talking, and he just tuned me out. But and I so wanted to have that opportunity. And one story I didn't really talk about it was we did an episode called Crew Dinners, and different people on the crew had one of their recipes, and I did my French harvest soup, which really ended up being a big hit. And he begrudgingly said that it was pretty good.
Begrudgingly. Yeah. But to work with one person, one sort of key person on a show for how many years? 10 years?
10 years on Emeril Live, but then we did a couple of other shows after that, one for TLC and one for ION. So really, we worked together for 13 years.
So Karen, in many ways, in a certain sense, you created the envelopes that became the Food Network. That was their first big hit, wasn't it?
Yeah, I would love to take credit for all that.
I'm giving you credit.
Yeah, thank you. But there are many other people who had a hand in that. But I definitely helped shape the show into something beyond a cooking show. When we did these big things, those were because I felt I could pull it off. And other people who didn't have that kind of experience in their background to do that. We did 90 shows a year, and it would get really boring in the studio after a while. It was just, thankfully it was a well-oiled machine, but after a while, you need to zip things up a little bit. They gave me the bandwidth to come up with different ideas. So we did a lot of fun, unusual specials. We shot a Halloween special at the Eastern State Penitentiary in Philadelphia, which was like a mini movie. And
talk about that a little.
Actually,
that was in the book. That was just crazy.
As I said before, the Food Network always required us to do holiday specials. So every year we had a Halloween special, and every year we try to get beyond and do something crazier than the year before. And I don't remember quite how we decided to do it there, but anyway, we found this great location. The Eastern State Penitentiary was where Al Capone had been incarcerated. And it's now a museum, and they do all of these things called like Terror at Night or some kind of crazy thing at Halloween, because it is the creepiest place you've ever been. It's teeny little cells, and it looks like Boris Karloff lives there. It's just water dripping down, holes in the ceiling, and it's just perfect. So we found a few spots, and that's when we started to work with other Food Network talent. And on the holiday specials in particular, we'd have other people come on the show. So we had Rachel Ray was on, and Mark Summers, who was doing Unwrapped, and Paula Dean, and everybody got into it. They got into their costumes, and it was a grueling, grueling day, but we shot it like a movie. And it came out great. We really had a fun time with it, but it was absolutely the creepiest place I've ever been. And I could swear I heard voices when I was walking down the hallway. But birds were lined up over on the ceiling, like Alfred Hitchcock's The Bird. You just were waiting for them to attack. That's the kind of things we did.
And we'll be back with more from Karen Katz in just a minute. And we are back with Karen Katz. Because I've planned elaborate things, I can just imagine the number of clipboard pages there were to get this to happen.
Oh, yeah.
Just incredible. Wow.
Yeah. I got a call from NASA, NASA,
Yeah.
and they were having trouble creating food that the astronauts could really taste because who knew? But they lost their flavor. Their ability to taste spicy foods and things would be diminished when they were on the International Space Station over long periods of time. So they wanted advice from Emeril about how to make the food tastier. And that's really all the call was about. But then I said, can he make them some of his food and can't we send it up there? And the PR person, Nicole Cloutier on the NASA side, she paused and then she said, I don't know, let me find out. And she had, you can imagine the red tape on her side to go through this. And it took us 18 months. But eventually we freeze-dried his food and we sent it up to the guys on the space station. And we did a kind of ship-to-shore little communication with them for the show. And they loved his food. And it was spicy enough.
Is that why people on airplanes always put Tabasco sauce in their tomato juice?
That could be.
People tell
I
me
don't know
that
if it happens that fast.
But no, people tell me that they have to make airline food, not that they worry about it in coach or economy, but if they're making good airline food, they have to adjust the seasonings because people's taste buds function differently in the air.
It's possible. I'm surprised it happens that quickly, but maybe. Happens in space. I know that.
I don't know. I have absolutely no memory of anything good I've ever eaten on an airplane, so I have no idea.
Yeah.
That's amazing. So here you're going along doing this, and meanwhile, you're just living your life. You're traveling. You did 90 shows a year, but did you do them in a very compressed time period, so you had time to decompress, or?
Yes, we did 10 shows a week, 9 times a year. In other words, because of Emeril's schedule, he couldn't come into the studio every day. He had restaurants, he had a whole empire to run. He would come into New York for a week. We would do 10 shows, and then I'd have the rest of the month to prep for the next 10 shows. And again, that became very cyclical, and we all knew what was coming. It sounds like it was a lot, and it was, but we got used to it.
Looking back over all this, is there anything that you would change? Because you were there at the beginning. You created this incredibly successful product that lasted 10 years or more, and then you went on to do other things. And the learning curve must have been incredibly steep, but also very, very thrilling. Is there advice that you can give to other people who want to have an incredibly successful TV food show?
That's a good question. I think like anything else, you need good talent. That's the number one. Obviously, I don't think that show would have worked with just anybody. Mm-hmm. So you need to know what your talent is capable of. If you look at someone like Bobby Flay, who's had, I don't know how many different shows on Food Network, he has been able to adapt to all of these new formats. So although not one individual show of his has lasted perhaps that long, although maybe some haven't. Forgive me, Bobby, if I'm not correct. He's really been able to parlay that into a whole bunch of different shows. He has probably been on Food Network longer than anybody. I think it's almost 30 years, if not 30 years.
Amazing to think of the Food Network as being more than 30 years old. But then
I think it started in 94. I'm fairly, maybe a little early, 93, 94, I think.
wow. Did you ever have the itch to go and work with another talent at the same time, another chef?
My agent wanted me to. And because after a while you do the same show, it's only one line on your resume. They were encouraging me to get out there and maybe leave the show. And I had a real loyalty to Emeril and to the show. And, it becomes your baby. And it's really, and it really was a vain thing, but the thought of someone else doing it killed me. So I stayed. And perhaps I stayed a little longer than I should, for my own career. But it worked out. Everything worked out. And, I ended up working with a lot of different talent on the show, but then I went on to do other things with other talent. So, shoulda, woulda, coulda, it's hard to know. It's hard to know.
One of the things I most enjoyed in the book, where you had, 4 rules, 5 rules, 10 rules of how to eat out with chefs, which just cracked me up because that is so true. I have no idea. They have a learned capacity for alcohol that continues to bewilder me, especially late at night. And can you talk a little bit about those meals?
It's impressive. Yeah, you can't. You are a fool to attempt to keep up with a chef when going out. It is amazing the capacity that they can eat and drink and still be standing. It's amazing. And I foolishly in the beginning tried to keep up, and I paid the very painful price for that. And then you have to learn. You have to learn how to hang with them because you have to you read the top 10 tips, you have to have every other drink. Make sure you nurse your drinks. And it's just, there's no possible way on earth you can keep up.
And it's hard you can't just enter into that fraternity or sorority. Now it's both, especially in my town. There are as many women chefs as male chefs, I think, in Boston. Did you start to feel that the food world were your people? Or did you always feel that the TV people were your people?
Oh, I would say, and you probably feel this too, I think chefs are very generous of spirit. I think they work in a service industry, so they're very much people. Not all of them, but many of them. And I never felt, from a cooking standpoint, on par with them at all. But they're a fun bunch. They're fun to hang with. And I certainly loved hanging with my crew as well. But one of what was really nice is after Emeril Live, we did a show called Emeril Green for TLC at one of the TLC networks and one of the Discovery networks. And we stayed actually, it wasn't TLC, excuse me, it was Planet Green. It was a new network. But we stayed at a Hyatt. That's all I could afford to bring where the crew would stay. And I was more than willing to put Emeril up at the Ritz. He wanted to hang with us. He didn't want to be alone. And it was a much smaller team who, we were working on location. And he likes to relax and be with people that he knows. And there was no, he's the chef, let's all salute him off, when we were not on set. When we were on set, we paid attention to him.
I have always felt that chefs were people and are people with white-collar intellects and blue-collar work ethics. It's their instinct. They finish up what they're doing, they start cleaning the stove. As big as their egos are, they're very grounded. And so that's always been a pleasure for me because you work with somebody who's grounded, and even if they're full of themselves, they're still grounded.
Yeah, exactly.
And so then ultimately, it came to an end. And why do you think that is? And how do you think that what does food TV need to be to succeed now?
Came to an end mostly because everything comes to an end. The fact that we were on 10 years was unbelievable. Most shows don't make it that long. And anything else, there was a point at which how many more tricks do I have in my bag and how many more different ways can we change the show or keep the audience? Our audience started to age out. The show started to become too expensive. And people forget it's a business. So if you're not making the profit you once made, maybe it's time to try something new. And also, it just doesn't look good if the best talent you have on has been on you for 10 years and you don't have anybody new. So there had to be room for new people and new things. And it's just the nature of the beast. But does that mean we took it that way? No. We all took it very personally. And it was hard. It really was a hard time for all of us. You become so defined by it. But it ended and it was time to move on.
And how was that for Emeril? Was he in mourning, or he was on to his other empire?
I don't think he's a mourning kind of guy. He very much moves forward. He wasn't happy about it, and he really built that network on his shoulders. And for many years, they treated him that way. It's not like we had an in-depth discussion about his personal feelings, so you would have to ask him. But I know he was not happy about it. But he had a lot of other things going on. And so he's the kind of guy, he just puts one foot, in front of the other, and it's what's next. And, moved on. He did just fine. He's doing just fine.
I'm not shocked. I'm not shocked. And Karen, tell me about the process of your writing the book. So you were several years done with the Food Network when you sat down to write it during COVID. Thank you, COVID. Did you find it easy? Had you written other things?
I've always loved writing, and I always wrote many of the shows that I worked on. And why I ended up writing a book, I'm not sure. I actually started writing screenplays. And I did a couple of those, but I had been in Southeast Asia working on a crazy reality show. And I had so much time to myself that I started to journal and do some things and noodle around. And then I started taking some writing courses just to get my chops back in this kind of format. And I was really encouraged. I would write little bits from the book in my homework or whatever. And I was really encouraged to really proceed with that. And I went on a few writing retreats, and I just really got into it. And it just started to come out. And I got a first draft, I would say, it didn't, maybe a year and a half with other things going on, whatnot. And then I really worked on honing it, editing it, going through. I'm very proud. Someone asked me the other day, did you really write it? And I was like, yeah, I really wrote it. And no ghostwriter here. It's all in my voice, as you probably can tell. And it was like doing a show in the sense that it's a crazy goal. Will I ever finish it? And then, yeah, I did. But I will tell you, that was when the work really started, once I finished the book. Because trying to get a book out there into the public against 500,000 other books that are written every year, that in itself has proven to be a whole new job.
It's true. A lot of people want to write memoirs. It doesn't always go well. Reading the book, it feels as though you just sat down and wrote it on a go, in 2 weeks, because it feels, which is not true, obviously, but it has that kind of fluency and humor and breeziness. It's a wonderful, fun book. I get sent a lot of books. I don't always respond to them. I loved this book.
So thank you very much.
No, I enjoyed it a lot.
Thank you.
I have to tell you, Karen, that I love reading books like yours and like Ruth Reichel that talk about how terrible their mothers were about food, because my mother was just off. I used to tell everybody who stayed in our house, don't eat anything in the refrigerator unless you put it there. Don't eat the cottage cheese with the blue scraped off. It turns out she was probably more right than wrong, because the sell-by dates and use-by dates are an art form rather than an objective piece of data in some cases. But I thought everybody's mother was a great cook except for mine, and it turned out I was not alone. But we were not poisoned. We grew up somehow. And I remember being about 8 or 9 or 10 years old and watching Julia Child on GBH, which was our local PBS station when there were only about 4 stations to choose from. And I said, Mom, you should watch this. There's a lady on TV who can teach you how to cook. And she was like, basically the adult version of go yourself. My world, Kochlöffel in German means simply a soup ladle. But in Yiddish, it means somebody who is always stirring the soup, making things happen. Sometimes there are gossips. It is an ironic form of high praise to call somebody a cockleffel. I would absolutely say that you are a cockleffel. You're at the top of your field as a food TV producer. Do you think there's anything about your background that led you to this career? Anything about being Jewish?
Yes and no. I would say where I got the chutzpah to do it was from my father. My father was a self-made man. He was a contractor. He grew up first generation. His parents were from Poland and Russia, and they had nothing. I remember visiting my grandparents, and the stairs in their apartment were cockeyed. So he really picked himself up and got himself to college and studied engineering and made his own way in the world. And to him, being a success was being on your own. And so for me, that's kind of something I took with me. And I think that's part of why I really freelanced my whole career. And because although you work for other people, to me, they were like clients as opposed to my boss. And because I was a contractor, just like he was. And I think, was that a particularly Jewish thing? Yes and no, because people came here and they had to pick themselves up. And so to be able to be the master of your own fate, I think there might be something there.
That strikes a chord with me, that entrepreneurship gene. I remember my grandfather telling me when I was coming out of business school, and I was pretty excited because I thought I might get a big job in one of the big corporations. He said, no, Jewish people don't work for those kind of companies. They work for themselves. Be smart. Yeah.
Yeah.
He said they don't even give you the key to the men's room.
Exactly. I never felt like I fit in. They would have these big corporate meetings, at Food Network, and not a lot of Jewish people in the executive suites, I must say, some. But I never felt comfortable in the rules. It was a little bit of a maverick in that way, and it didn't always work to my advantage. But it just following the rules, and this is the corporate way, it just wasn't my cup of tea.
You've referenced the fact that your mom was not a fabulous cook, but what was it like to eat at your house? Was being around the dining table and entertaining an important part of your growing up?
It was pretty much torture. Nobody got along with anybody. And my parents fought all the time. They almost divorced 3 times, and they kept it together somehow. And most of it was the stress of having 3 rotten kids who would just fight all the time. And inevitably, at the dinner table, somebody would choke every night, and not from the food. It was just from eating and screaming at the same time. And to this day, all of us, my brothers and I, were all speed eaters because all you wanted to do was finish and get out, because it was not a pleasant experience. I remember once my college roommate, I invited her down, and she came from a very wealthy family in Winnetka, Illinois, and they had these lovely dinners with all the nice china and all of this stuff. And she comes to our house, and the dinner, I think, was over in less than a half hour. And just because everybody passing the food, let's finish. And I think she was in shock after it. She just didn't know what any of it was about. Yeah, it was not good. It's good now that we're older, but we don't live near each other. I'll tell you that much.
Do you have a sense of having had Jewish food growing up?
Some. I mean, mostly from my grandmothers. My maternal grandmother, she was the one who could cook. She could cook. So she would do kugels and matzo ball soup and all that, and she was a good cook. And if I got anything, it was from her. My maternal grandmother, to this day, she only made one thing well, and it was these they were like Russian tea cakes, but I don't think she used butter or sugar. And they came out hard as a rock. But for whatever reason, because it was the only nice thing I remember about her, because she also was a screamer and didn't get along with my father. But to this day, I'm trying to find the recipe, and it clearly doesn't exist because she made it wrong. But I do remember those cookies.
So people ask me, now you've been around and you're from New York, so you know about the idea that there is such a thing as Jewish food. But what is the difference between Jewish food and food that Jews eat? In our world, in my generation, we just eat everything. When sushi first came out.
Chinese food on Sunday. Yeah, Chinese food on Sunday. I think who doesn't love to go to a Jewish deli and to have all stuffed derma and knishes and pastrami sandwiches? But that's that kind of Germanic Jewish food, the Ashkenazi kind of diet that, with potatoes and all of that. I'm actually not a huge fan of it that much. I don't love matzo ball soup. My husband does, but I don't love it myself. But I just think it's the food you grow up with. And so it becomes familiar to you. I mean, it's like gefilte fish. I love gefilte fish, but I think if you give gefilte fish to someone who's never had it, most people just get freaked out about it. Yet I think our appetites are global. I'll eat anything. I don't think that's just a Jewish thing. Certainly, I'm more than open to what's out there in the world.
And just as a final kind of question, why do you think there are so many Jewish women who've chosen careers in food, professional careers in food?
I think it's part of the work ethic. It's not easy to have a life in food, and it requires a lot of hard work and dedication and organization. And I think that as a woman, that is in our blood for generations, just taking care of business. And I think there's also the nature of what you're doing is really feeding people, and it's a way to communicate love and care and sustenance. It's a very basic human thing. There, I think, is something attractive about that and satisfying about that. So nourishing.
I call it kind of tikkun olam, which is translate repair the world. And when you feed someone, you've made the world a little bit better.
Exactly.
And it's a language of love in its own way.
It is. I'm thrilled that you enjoy the book. Part of the humor of the book is partially because of my Jewish background and the way that I look at the world through a funny lens. Even when things are a bit dark, there's got to be a little bit of humor in there.
This has been great talking to you. Just wonderful. And for everybody, the book is Getting Sauced by Karen Katz. How I Learned Everything I Know About Food from Working in TV. And it is fun, really fun. Also, I learned a ton about TV and TV on food.
You've been listening to Koch Level, Jewish Women in Food, brought to you by The Food Voice. Executive producer and host Louisa Kasdan. Audio director and composer Michael Moss. Recorded at Soundscape Productions in Dedham, Massachusetts. We thank Heritage Radio Network and the combined Jewish philanthropies of Greater Boston for their generous support.